Welcome to Manufacturing Talk Radio, the only show that takes a look at the obstacles and opportunities open to small to mid-sized enterprises that manufacture here in America. Brought to you by All Metals and Forge Group, with your hosts Tim Grady and Lou Wise.
Welcome, everyone, to Manufacturing Talk Radio. We're back on the air. My name is Tim Grady. I'm here with my co-host, Lou Wise. We have 5 guests for you today. We've got an important subject to talk about. But first, a very interesting news item from you, Lou. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Today we're having a special show. It's a 90-minute show. And it'd be nice if you all took a little bit of a 90-minute break from work. I'm sure your employers wouldn't mind, especially if they're being affected by our topic that we're going to be talking about. And the topic, again, is I think this is the 3rd show that we're having regarding the Los Angeles slowed-down port issue, which is still going on, maybe getting worse, certainly not getting better. And we have 5 special guests that are professionals in the issues that are relative to the port issue. The show is so important that we decided yesterday that we wanted to get the head man involved. So we did send off an email to President Obama yesterday, and amazingly so, we did get a response this morning, and I feel I'd like to read you that response. And our show coordinator is Sharon Odell, and it said, "Hello, Sharon. Thanks for contacting us. We said late last week that this dispute is up to the 2 parties to resolve at the bargaining table, and we urge them to do so expeditiously as possible. We continue to closely monitor the situation. Anything else, please let us know." And this did come from Mr. Obama, the Executive Office of the President of the United States. I thank him for that. I don't necessarily thank him for his the content of his comments. And we want to talk about this and find out all the issues that are going on and why Washington is not getting involved. How long is this going to continue? What is it going to do to the economy? Why is it costing us $2 billion a day? And I think, Tim, at this point, I'd like you to introduce our 5 panelists, and let's get the show on the road.
Well, we'll introduce 4 of them. Chad Moutre, who's the chief economist for the National Association of Manufacturers, is going to join us at 2 o'clock. But here on the 1 o'clock hour, we have Peter Friedman, who's the executive director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, Mark Herzl, who's president of the Los Angeles Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association, Jonathan Gold, who's vice president, supply chain and customs policy with the National Retail Federation, and Jason Brewer, vice president, communications and advocacy, Retail Industry Leaders Association. And Peter, let me go to you first. And let me not be too unkind to the president, but I feel like Obama fiddles while agriculture burns. How's agriculture doing with this situation?
The situation is a disaster. The West Coast port disruption is a disaster. Listen, the contract between the Longshoremen's Union and the employers of the longshoremen, that is the marine terminal operators along the West Coast, the ones that handle the containerized cargo moving through those ports, that contract expired at the end of June 2014. It was no surprise that it was going to expire, but the parties waited till about a month before it expired, before the ILWU and the PMA began negotiating in earnest. And then we thought that maybe a few weeks after that expiration, they would finally get the issues, whatever issues that were, resolved. We had been told by both sides, by both labor and management, that the issues were not insurmountable and not significant. And here we are now 9 months later, and the disruption is getting worse and worse. In fact, for agriculture, it reflects the injury that's being faced by the economy in general. Importers and exporters are suffering. The extent of agriculture exports through the West Coast ports, the loss is about $1.75 billion per month. That's exports that are not going out of the West Coast ports. And for agriculture, there are few alternatives, very few. One cannot really economically air freight. One cannot move the cargo large distances to go through East Coast or Gulf Coast ports. So the bottom line is that cargo that can't go through the West Coast ports doesn't leave the United States. That's lost exports. And the volume of agriculture exports is now less than 50% through the West Coast ports of what it normally is. That means we are booted out of foreign markets, not because those foreign countries won't buy from us. They want to buy from us, but they can't because we can't deliver dependably. And so we believe that the injury is not only significant now, the $1.75 billion of agriculture exports that are not leaving the country each month now, but that the impact will be permanent in many instances because there's nothing that we export in agriculture or forest products from this country that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. Today, and this is a timely discussion, today the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation conducted a hearing. Excellent testimony by various witnesses, including Cargill Meat, which described very specifically the injury to their ability to export chilled beef and pork to our Asian customers, and the fact that we cannot export it now because the time in the supply that it takes through the supply chain is now so long that the customers over there won't be able to buy it. That's all a result of the disruption on the West Coast. U.S. senators lined up today to decry the injury that's being caused to exporters and importers and implored the PMA and the ILWU to resolve this now. We expect some letters to be delivered to key senators signed by literally hundreds of their constituents who are being detrimentally impacted, injured by this situation. There are many, many jobs being lost right now, not only in agriculture, but in the entire supply chain, as companies simply cannot conduct business without a steady means of importing or exporting.
Well, Peter, how do you feel about the comment in the White House email stating that they feel as though that the dispute is up to the two parties to resolve, and they feel that they can or should be able to do so 9 months later?
Well, I think all of us in this interview today would agree that the two parties can and should resolve it. They have in the past. They just haven't taken 8-9 months to do so, and we haven't had the crippling impact. Now, 12 years ago, in 2002, actually 13 years ago now, the West Coast ports were shut down completely. In other words, the parties were unable to resolve it. They were shut down completely. The president stepped in forcefully, emphatically, properly, legally, under the authorities provided by the Taft-Hartley law, that pushed the two parties back to the negotiating table, the same parties that are involved in this current negotiation, pushed them back to the negotiating table, forced the ports to reopen and operate while they negotiated, and thereafter there was a conclusion to the negotiations and a resumption of normal operations. We believe this president should step in. It is high time for him to step in. He has proposed that the Federal Mediation and Conciliation Service assign a mediator. They did so, but a mediator is only serving at the pleasure of the two parties, and if one of the parties, the PMA or the ILWU, does not want the mediator to provide services, then the mediator cannot force his way into the process. And in fact, the mediator is not engaged right now. It is engaged from time to time.
Well, Peter, during the State of the Union message, President Obama made it quite clear that we should have, and I think I have the quote correct, we should continue to have strong unions. If they got any stronger, they'd be running the country, and he would be working for $147,000 instead of the union members. To me, it sounds as though that he's very much in favor of keeping the unions strong and not wanting to go heads-on against the unions, especially when there's a presidential election coming up in 2 years.
Well, you are correct, but it's no surprise. I mean, politicians get elected with support from various constituencies, and organized labor has been one of President Obama's core key constituencies. So what you're saying is no surprise. However, there are many elected representatives, both sides of the aisle, some who were elected with labor union support and some who are not, who believe that the parties have to resolve this because the impact on the greater economy is such that it cannot be allowed, this dispute, to continue without abatement. That the impact of what I mentioned of $1.75 billion per month for agriculture just now is nothing compared to what the impact will be if the ports shut down entirely. And as John Gold of the National Retail Federation will be able to say, the numbers, when you talk about the economy as a whole, imports and exports both, will be substantially more than that. I would only say this, that the President has touted his National Export Initiative. In fact, this calamity is decimating U.S. exports. It will have long-term, including permanent impacts. It is unlikely that during the remainder of his term that our exports will fully recover, so that this situation, not of his causing this dispute, but under his watch, will constitute the export initiative of his presidency, the loss of U.S. export presence in the global marketplace due to the uncertainty that this labor management dispute has imposed on our ability to deliver affordably and dependably to the global marketplace. And in the meantime, Canada, Argentina, Brazil, Australia, the European Union are all too happy to supply the agriculture and forest products to the global markets that we are now not able to supply.
I would agree, Peter. Mark, you're on the ground there in Los Angeles. What's going on with your customs brokers and freight forwarders? Are they PMA members, and are they frustrated by the pain of all this?
No, the Los Angeles customs brokers and freight forwarders are the people who clear the goods through U.S. Customs and make the transportation arrangements for the goods to and from the U.S. To their various destinations. So our members are actively working with our clients and trying to minimize the impact of any delay in the supply chain. As Peter, rightly pointed out, the biggest impact, negative impact upon U.S. customers is the instability or the irregularity of the supply chain. As your members know and listeners know, you need to know when something's coming in so you can plan to include it in your production. And if you don't have that reliability, it makes it very difficult and expensive, and there's a lot of waste involved in moving cargo via different routes. We have some of our members are helping their clients actually route cargo through Houston and back to Los Angeles, simply to avoid the unknown of how long it's going to take to recover cargo out of the ports. So we've got people who are flying cargo in to get cargo to where it needs to come into the U.S. And on some of the retail options, that's something that one can do, but it has a significant negative impact upon the profitability of those shipments. So the negative impact to the economy overall is huge. We're somewhat buffered by that in that we can arrange for the transportation of goods into and out of basically any U.S. port. But the point that Peter makes about losing business, U.S. export business to other countries is being echoed among our members, where cargo is no longer being sourced out of the U.S. because it's unreliable. It's now coming out of Australia or some other country. I think the biggest thing that we're seeing is the negative impact it's having upon all areas of the supply chain. Just recently, the Harbor Trucking Association in Los Angeles has declared a force majeure on the containers that they're trying to, the empty containers that they're trying to return to the terminals, who are some days open and some days closed, and oftentimes not taking empty containers because their terminals are still full of the import containers that need to outgate. So to Peter's point, the negative impact that all of this is having on the national economy is starting to increase in its magnitude as it ripples through the supply chain.
I'd like to ask one of my other pet peeves in life. Why is it that, and I'll name them, CBS, ABC, NBC, Fox News, CNN, all the prime guys out there in the news world, why are they 95% gone black on this topic?
I wish I could answer that. I think it is interesting and it's accurate. I mean, we saw some traction in the big media Friday. I think Jonathan was on NBC. I think NPR did a bit, but it was a month or so ago that the BBC actually did a bit on what was going on here, and I think you're absolutely right to identify that the local or the large media organizations haven't looked at this as important as it is, and it's been a large part of the issue. If there are trade organizations or trade publications that have done a very good job of keeping this in front of those people whose specialty is the supply chain, but it is now having a bigger impact, and I don't know what that number is, but it seems that when it gets to impact a certain number of people, then they start to pay more attention. But this is a serious issue that could have been deserved certainly more attention earlier on.
Well, certainly more than the Whitney Houston special of the other night. That's for sure.
Look at
this is Jason. Can I just add one quick point, since the president was brought up earlier? This is one area where if the president did speak out, whether it was from the White House or in a statement to the press, or he's going to be in California, I think, at the end of this week, and could say something, it probably would get on the radar screen of some of the major networks if the president showed some concern publicly that this dispute would have negative ramifications for the entire economy, not just for retailers, not just for exporters, but for everybody if it's not resolved. And I think that's one thing that we're looking for from the president and from the White House, is to show some leadership so that there is perchance more coverage of this, so that the average American understands the potential ramifications.
John,
supply chain is foundational. Supply chain is one of the foundations of our economy, but a foundation like a foundation of a house is often not visible. So if you can't move cargo from place to place, well, that will have an impact, but not necessarily immediately. So people are still able to go to their stores and get most of the things they're used to. It does show up. Mardi Gras is starting next week. They don't have the beads. They may not have the beads. Now, you can, at great extra expense, fly beads from China to New Orleans. You cannot fly beef and pork and hay and almonds and cotton and hides and leather out. Too heavy, too expensive, can't do it. But the impact is being felt on the farms around the country. But those farms are in rural areas. Those farms are maybe out of sight, out of mind of major media that you just mentioned that are based in New York and so forth. And as long as the goods are making it into the stores one way or another, then consumers aren't feeling or seeing the impact. But absolutely correct. The role of the president is to be a leader, and other presidents, Clinton, Bush, have been leaders in this area when it came to port disputes. This White House has said that they have been engaged. They've been monitoring. They are doing things they can't tell us about, which is probably true. It'd be fine if they're bringing the leaders of the PMA and the ILWU into the White House and having a heart-to-heart talk with these guys. I don't know if they're doing so, but I absolutely agree. This would be the time for the president to hold a news conference and talk about something, even though the average American doesn't actually see this foundational and the cracks in the foundation of our economy that are occurring now.
Yeah, well, let me go to Jonathan Gold here for a minute. John, you're with the National Retail Federation, and I suspect the president, if he does make a statement in California, it's going to be using his strategic patience initiative. What's happening to the retailers? They appear to be getting into some pain here.
This pain has been going on for months now. For our members, we've been looking at this issue since last year, even before the negotiations started. For our members, the critical time is December. Make sure they have the holiday shipments in, and we're looking at a peak shipping season, the August, September, October timeframe. So our members were looking at putting contingency plans in place early before the negotiations even started. So that was looking at shifting cargoes to the East Coast, Gulf Coast, Canada, Mexico, bringing product in earlier to make sure they had it in warehouses and were stocked, looking at air cargo, which again was 8 to 10 times more expensive. Again, they were doing everything they can to ensure that product is on the store shelves when the consumer gets there, so the consumer doesn't see the impact. Unfortunately, all of this is going to hit the retail bottom line because a lot of those costs are not going to be passed along to the consumer. It's going to be the retailer who's going to eat those costs. And this, again, has been going on for 9 months. We sat down with both parties back in April. We sat down with them separately to talk about the negotiations, what they expected, what the major issues were going into it. Both parties, as Peter said, they noted that the negotiations were going to be tough. They always are. But, they start in mid-May because that's the way they've always done it. Well, in today's day and age, you can't just do it because that's the way you've always done it. Obviously, we've got a failure here because the negotiations are still ongoing after 9 months. They spent the first 4 months of negotiations just talking about the health care issues. Up until August, there were several joint press releases from the parties saying they were at the table making progress, working through the issues. There was a commitment from both parties to continue to let the cargo flow. And then all of a sudden, after August, something changed. They announced they had a tentative agreement on health care, which, again, was one of the biggest issues going into the negotiations because of the Cadillac tax issue, where the PMA had said they were going to be subject to a $125 million hit under the Affordable Care Act, and that was something they had to address. And then after that, all the other issues were going to be discussed. But then all of a sudden, come October, we started seeing the announcements from PMA about the slowdowns from the ILWU. We started having the back and forth in the press releases, and now we're in this crisis congestion situation where you have the ports of LA and Long Beach are at 98% capacity and really can't take on any more cargo. You've got container vessels that are lining up on a daily basis. Those numbers are increasing, and this is something that needs to get resolved now. And again, I think the focus here is that this isn't just a retail issue. This impacts every segment of the economy who relies on the ports to move their goods, import or export. We're hearing about the ag folks, as Peter mentioned, who are getting killed because of this. You have manufacturers who are relying on inputs to production in their just-in-time inventory that are having trouble getting those parts for the assembly lines. So this really is having a global impact. It's not just a national impact, but it's really having an impact on a global scale. And something needs to be done to get the parties to get to a final agreement. This is a little bit different than where we were back in 2002 when we had the lockout. At least back then you had a continuing of the contract short term, but you didn't have the slowdown issues. When PMA saw the slowdowns, that's when they did the lockout. We just went through this again during the 2012 and 2013 for the East Coast labor negotiations. And while the administration and others point to the fact that the East Coast labor union and management got a deal done through collective bargaining, there was a little bit of a difference there too because they did a contract extension. There was a constant threat of a strike from the union, but they still had a contract in place so that there was a grievance mechanism. If either party was engaging in slowdowns or other activities, they could go to an arbitrator and get a ruling. That's what's desperately missing in this negotiations. That's why we have the slowdowns and the back and forth between the parties.
Yeah, it's very true.
As John mentioned,
Peter, I know that you have to leave us here in a couple of minutes. I just want to give you a moment, and then I want to go to Jason. But Peter, you make some powerful points about what's happening even on the rural farms of America. How long do you think it's going to be before they recover from this, if ever?
Well, first you have to resolve the dispute, and I would say most of the people on this call, if we were asked that question last July, would have said by the middle of August, and by the end of August we would have said, by the middle of September, and so the fact is nobody can make a prediction of when it's going to be resolved. Although I think my sense is we're getting within a week or two of that, but again, could be wrong. However, as the individual with Cargill Meat today testified before the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation, from the moment that the contract dispute is settled and the ports begin to start unwinding from this mess, it's going to take 3 to 4 months before cargo is able to flow in its normal fashion. In the meantime, however, we have already heard from our potato exporters, meat exporters, and hay exporters from their foreign customers whom they are visiting right now in Asia, that we have two things going against us. One, the U.S. dollar is high now, making our exports more expensive, and this is not only agriculture but manufactured goods as well. Our exports more expensive than exports of the same products from other countries, and B, we have shown ourselves to be undependable, and if we're still 3 to 4 months after the contract is resolved, still going to be undependable for those 3 to 4 months and delayed, the recovery could be years. And in the case of some California almonds that were locked out of the Japanese market in 2002, they still have not recovered that market. In other words, the recovery could never happen for some of our agriculture exports.
Well, Peter, we appreciate you being on the show. Thank you for taking the time to join us. You're exactly right. Some of this stuff is not going to be recoverable. In fact, in 2002, it was 6 months before the West Coast ports began to operate normally again. So thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much, and thank you for covering this topic. Very important public service you are providing.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Jason, the Retail Industry Leaders Association is new to our show, so if you wouldn't mind giving our audience a snapshot of what you folks do, because you represent a lot of the major retailers, and then give us some idea of what they're experiencing with this.
Sure. So RELA represents some of the world's largest retail companies. We've got over 200 retailers that have over 100,000 stores. So you can imagine who our members are and the footprint that we've got. And this is a huge, huge problem. You know, John did a great job of outlining prior to the last holiday season what some retailers were able to do with the foresight that, you know, a slowdown could occur, you know, bringing goods in early and warehousing, perhaps rerouting things to different ports, in extreme cases using air freight, but as he mentioned, incredibly, incredibly expensive. You know, we've sort of run out of those levers in many cases because the slowdown has been going on for so long. You can only reroute so many ships to other ports before they're over capacity. And you can only fly in certain goods, and you can only do it so often because of the expense. And so the holiday season, I think retailers did a great job of trying to mitigate the impact on consumers. So maybe it wasn't something that was recognized. But when you look at the upcoming spring season, you know, spring is the equivalent of the holiday shopping season for some industries, for some stores. You think of fashion, home and garden, home improvement. You know, those are the types of retailers that have very big springs that rival their holiday season in terms of importance. And so this is going to have a huge impact on them in the spring and leading into the summer. And, you know, for retailers, this is really it's a twofold problem. You've got the obvious problem of getting goods on shelves and trying to, you know, mitigate the impact on the consumer. But then on the backside, as Peter mentioned, the supply chain being sort of the foundation of the economy. If this ultimately impacts the economy and causes, you know, the recovery to derail, if it causes certain industries to fall down, to you know, take time to recover, if jobs are lost, that impacts retailers obviously, because, you know, the hotter the economy is, the better off the retail sector is. The more people that are employed and are, you know, spending dollars in stores, the better it is for us. And so, you know, we have a problem on the front end of making sure that our operations can function, but on the back end, if this impacts the recovery, it's going to be another huge problem for retailers. And so, you know, that's where I think we're looking to the White House to provide some leadership, because if this does impact the recovery, this may not have been the president's fault, but I think, if, as Peter mentioned, it will happen on his watch. And I think people will blame him for that. And so, you know, this is something that I think, to the point that was made earlier about the major networks, we do hope that this does get a little bit more attention, that the average person begins to understand what kind of impact it could have on the entire economy as a whole, because it's not just going to be something that impacts retailers and exporters. It ultimately could impact everybody.
As representatives of the manufacturing sector in this country, as Tim and I have taken on that role, and number two, the fact that my company, All Metals and Forge Group, who's supplying forged products, heavy forged products for a heavy industry, we bring in what they call starting stock from overseas to produce heavy forgings for the manufacturers here in this country. And when we talk to our manufacturer customers about the port, for the most part, they don't know anything about it. We wind up sending them some of the photographs that you gentlemen have supplied us with, which they look like cartoon characters at the port, that you can't see the port because of all the containers. This is going to have a devastating effect in manufacturing, and manufacturing is first coming out of the Great Recession from 2008. Employment is good. Once they start going against the tide, Shell Oil, for example, has laid off 4,000 people last week. Exxon laid off a similar number. Weatherford Corporation, which is also in oil and gas and manufacturing, has laid off 2,000 people. These numbers are going to start showing up next month in the Institute of Supply Management report, as it did in the past month. So this covers almost every aspect of our U.S. economy. And again, this is one of the reasons why Tim and I have taken on this role. And again, we appreciate you gentlemen participating and helping us get the message out, not only to manufacturers, but to agriculture, to manufacturers, to all supply chain venues.
Lou, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're right, and that's what was mentioned before, is that the supply chain managers and the forwarders have worked very hard to mitigate the impact upon their companies so that they could sustain this growth, through this tough time. But you can only run at 110% for so long, and then once the engine dies, it's dead, right? And I think that's the point to where we're getting at this point, is we're running out of alternative options that minimizes the impact upon the customers, and we've done a good job of that. It maybe has been to our detriment, and people haven't felt the impact. But that's what we need to do for our individual companies, and that's really where the president needs to step up and recognize that work that has been done to minimize the impact upon consumers and the overall economy. But then, really, be the bully pulpit that demands that the two get together and talk. I think we had a situation a few years ago in Los Angeles where the clerks union at the harbor were going through a contract negotiation, and at that point, the mayor of Los Angeles, flew back into town from a trade mission to Mexico, where he heard people there talking about how they weren't going to buy from Los Angeles because of the unreliable supply chain, and got them both in the room and sat down with them and said, we're not leaving here until we figure this out. And that's the kind of leadership that I think we're looking for from the president, is fully respect that they need to figure it out between the two of them, but someone's got to be, the facilitator of that demand, and getting those parties to work it out between themselves, and share with each other. Hey, realize that you have a better deal than most other people do in your place on this point, and opposition, you've got to look at this and maybe step up on one of these cases. There needs to be someone, and the only one who really has the authority and the political strength to do that is the president. And by not stepping up and getting actively involved in demanding both sides make some concessions and come to some agreement, you've left the American people hanging, in my humble opinion, our humble opinion.
And if I could add a couple things to that, you've seen a number of legislators who are now getting engaged that have been sending letters nonstop to both parties, as well as the president. You had a joint letter from Senators Feinstein and Boxer yesterday that was pretty strongly worded, that went to the parties, basically saying, time to get a deal. There was a joint letter signed by 89 members of the House, both Republican and Democrat, spearheaded by Representative Reichert and Schrader, a Democrat and a Republican, that went to the parties a couple of weeks ago. We have done continuous letters from industry to the parties as well as to the administration, urging them to get engaged and to make sure they're paying attention to this. And the impact on this is already being felt, but a complete shutdown, according to a study that NRF did with the National Association of Manufacturers, for a 5-day complete shutdown, you're looking at close to $2 billion a day to the U.S. economy. And that will grow to about $2.5 billion a day if a shutdown lasts longer than 20 days, and that number will just continue to increase. So these are some real numbers that we're talking about and real impacts that are already being felt. We again encourage everyone, members, to be reaching out to their members of Congress, making sure they're aware of what's going on. You've had the governors on the West Coast that have communicated with the parties. The mayors of LA and Long Beach have been engaged in working with the parties. But I think, again, it's time for that presidential leadership, again, to get them into a room. And whether it's public or not, at this point, he just needs to call the parties and say enough is enough. His agenda, both trade and transportation, is at real risk of not being able to move forward. And it's time for the parties to get an agreement. I mean, at this point, the parties can't even agree on how close or how far they are from an actual agreement, which continues to frustrate everybody and continues to add to the uncertainty of what we're all facing with the ports.
Yeah, and one thing I just wanted to add to that, that John's study couldn't possibly measure is something that Peter brought up, which is how many relationships are permanently damaged. It may be $2 billion a day, and that's terrible. But what happens even when they do get back to work? How many customers did we lose that we'll never get back? How many trading relationships will be permanently damaged? How many folks will never recover, whether it's on the ag side, the retail side, the manufacturing side? And so there's a short-term damage that can be measured, but then there's a long-term damage that's almost impossible to measure.
And the long-term damage also goes to the ports themselves because they're going to lose business. We've already heard from many major and small retailers who said they're done. They're going elsewhere. They're not going to go through the West Coast ports anymore because of this. The uncertainty is too much of an impact on their ability to get goods to the store shelves. And while the agricultural and farmers and manufacturers might not have that option, for retailers, they're going to lose their business. And you're already starting to see that with other ports on the East Coast and Gulf Coast whose numbers are increasing. And they're going to continue to increase just as it did after 2002.
Actually, we signed our contract on Friday, moving our freight to the East Coast. We cannot afford to lose any more customers. It's just an untenable situation. And I think maybe we're writing the wrong message to the wrong person. So I think tomorrow I'm going to send an email to Michelle and see what she could do about conveying the message to Mr. President. It might have a greater influence.
Jason, are you also hearing from your retail members that, because we're beginning to see it, I'm in Atlanta, and I'm beginning to hear the rumblings of the movement of distribution centers from the west to the east, because 2/3 of the population of the country lives east of a line if you draw from Dallas to Minneapolis, and so that means 2/3 of the consumers are in the east. Are you hearing your member companies saying, we're moving our DCs to the east, and we'll come in Maryland, Savannah, et cetera?
There'll always be some talk of that, but the reality is those are very long-term fixes. Those are very long-term strategic decisions that, ultimately won't impact anything for years to come. And there is some difficulty, if a larger percent of your goods are coming from the Pacific, it obviously makes sense to ship them to the West Coast and not the East. And so are there ways to, balance things out a bit more so that you're not so heavily reliant on one coast? Yes. But those are long-term, it's a long-term process and not something that's going to impact what we may go through if there's a shutdown.
Yeah, Jason,
John, you mentioned that. I'd love to hear from you, John, on this issue.
Sure. No, I mean, I agree with Jason, but here's what's going to happen is that folks are going to shift away from L.A., Long Beach, Seattle, Tacoma, and Oakland, and they're going to go to Vancouver, Prince Rupert. There's a nice little port that's coming in down in Mexico, Lázaro Cárdenas. Those ports are all going to gain from the U.S. inability to get a contract done. So companies are already looking at that. I mean, they are so fed up right now with this whole situation. They are looking to shift. I mean, no doubt. You've got the Panama Canal, which is going to add to that. You've got now discussion of a Nicaragua canal. So that shift is going to happen. And when you look back at 2002, when the West Coast, had close to 60% of the cargo that was coming in, and now they're down below 44%, and that's going to continue to shift. So it's, they're shooting themselves in the collective foot right now by continuing to drag this on.
And Mark, how about your members? Are you beginning to hear rumblings as you process paperwork that they're looking at their alternatives?
Well, we're actively involved in rerouting cargo for our members. The unique thing about our work is that regardless of where we're physically located, we can still assist our customers, and many of our members have offices around the U.S. and even in some other countries. So we're not negatively impacted financially directly on the rerouting of this cargo, but where we see it is part of our service to our customers is to help them develop the most cost-effective supply chain. And although we can enable them or give them a solution that allows them to get their goods ultimately to market, it's certainly not the most efficient. And so, what we're trying to do is to help find the best way. I mean, to get the cargo to where it needs to go, and we believe that the Los Angeles, Long Beach, and West Coast operations are overall, hands down, the most efficient way to do it when the labor is working. There is great steps that the Port of Long Beach, for instance, has been taking in increasing automation, so decreasing our reliance on labor in some of these cases. For instance, the Middle Harbor project that's going to be able to process one of these vessels with about a third of the current labor that it takes to unload a vessel, and that first vessel is due in November 2015. That's likely what some of these discussions are about as automation increases and some of the physical people are not necessarily needed to do the jobs that they are today. But that's something that we have all in our jobs in our various businesses have gone through and realized, and it's part of making things more efficient. I met an elder statesman of the ILWU a few years ago who I think rightly realized when the containerization first came into play in the 70s, the number of longshoremen on the docks was greatly negatively impacted. They lost a lot of jobs, but if you were to look at the number of jobs that we have today in the ILWU compared to what happened in the 70s, simply because of the increase in the efficiency in which goods move, we have more jobs today than we did back then. There is going to be a negative impact for the ILWU in regards to number of positions available as automation increases, but I think we've got to take the longer term view that years from now, as we make goods more economically and efficiently flow through our ports, the more jobs are actually going to result.
If I can say that, because I think that's a great point, is the fact that if the ports make themselves more efficient, that means more trade's going to come through and more jobs will be there, which I think is being lost in this conversation. But I think the other thing we need to realize, too, is that, even though the ports are going through the labor negotiations, L.A., Long Beach, and some of the other ports are facing many other challenges that we can't even start to address until this contract is done. The whole issue of the chassis, how that issue has just been a complete mess and a nightmare for people to figure out. How do we handle the larger vessels that are coming in? You still have horrible turn times at L.A. Long Beach with the truckers. So there are a lot of issues that need to be worked on by all parties, but we can't even sit down and have conversations on that until this contract is resolved.
Can I interrupt this portion of the topic and kind of introduce, for the sake of our listeners, are either of the three of you, any of the three of you, in a position to give us a 5-minute critique on the Taft-Hartley Act, if in fact that were to be invoked?
Sure. I mean, just real quick, if Taft-Hartley were to be invoked, and this is the president would invoke the act if there is a complete shutdown, a strike, or a lockout. He does have the ability if there is a threat, but that isn't defined. Essentially, it would be a cooling off period for the parties, would put the parties back to work, back at the negotiating table again with the federal mediator, and would be a 90-day process to work through to get a deal done. But it's essentially a nuclear option. We'd rather that the parties get a deal done before that is put into place. It did take President Bush 10 days back in 2002 before he decided to act on invoking Taft-Hartley. And, there's no guarantees whether or not this president would do that or not. We hope he would step in and do that.
I sense that after 9 months of going through this torture in the ports, that the likelihood of that happening is slim to none. But that said, it doesn't seem very likely that the two negotiating parties are coming to any conclusions themselves. And that puts, needless to say, our country in a very vulnerable position. And I'll even take it one step further, that there's homeland security issues that are potentially involved here also. The fact that we're running out of supplies, we're running out of component parts. A lot of component parts are, for the automotive industry. We had a great year last year in automotive industry. Those parts that come in from out of the country aren't coming in. Auto sales are going to be affected. It's our number one industry in the United States. And like I said, Homeland Security can be also affected by all of this. And I'm at a loss and almost speechless as to what the conclusion and the solution is to get the parties either back to the table and really sit down and negotiate this, or get the president to get up and have the nerve to do what needs to be done.
Jason, I'm wondering if any of your members have, if you've heard from any of them about reductions in workforce because of this West Coast port slowdown. Jason, you still with us?
Oops, sorry, I put you on mute there for a second. Fortunately, that hasn't been something that our members have discussed, job losses. But, it's not out of the realm of possibility if there is an actual lockout or strike. As John's study mentioned, $2 billion a day in lost GDP. The impact of that, the impact of what could happen if the automotive industry slips up. Let's not forget what happened. The cause, the root of the last Great Recession. It was, in theory, one industry, housing, that really took down the whole house of cards. And so there is such a symbiotic relationship between the supply chain and so many different industries that if one or more were to stumble, what is the long-term impact on the economy? If the economy tanks, there obviously will be job losses in the retail sector, in virtually every sector, and that's something that would be maddening because it's preventable. This would be an unforced error on the part of the White House to allow this to occur. And again, it may not be his fault, but it will be on his watch. And it's something, given that it is preventable, you would think that there would be senior level people at the White House talking today about how to prevent this from happening. And thus far, we just haven't seen it. Certainly haven't seen it publicly.
Yes, we haven't seen it publicly. Interestingly enough, the people who have gained the most, as Mark pointed out in this, is the ILWU. In 2002, when they went on strike, or when they got locked out, there were 10,500 West Coast port workers who got locked out. Today, there are 13,500 West Coast port union employees. So they didn't suffer, they've gained. And I know the PMA has laid bare their latest contract offer publicly to what they're offering to the union. And in fact, they're going to absorb the $150 million Cadillac penalty. They're increasing their pay by, I think it is 3% a year each year. They're increasing their pension contribution per worker from $82,000 to $88,000 a year. They're keeping their health care plan free of charge. So, if anybody wants to talk about redistribution of wealth, I guess they should look at their union brethren, because they have the money.
Well, I think the big issue, though, and I'm not at the table, and I don't have any inside information, but from what my analysis is, the issue is who's a full-time ILWU member, Class A, and who is a casual, a Class B. The ILWU has been trying to increase the number of Class A full-time people, and I think that's where the biggest rub is likely to be. As you pointed out, we've seen numbers increase, and with increased automation, you should see just the opposite. And that's the rub that everyone's facing. The people who have been able to make it to the table and become a full-time ILWU member have had it very, very good. But if you look at the life of a casual, and in my humble opinion, what the ILWU makes their casual workers go through to get to become a full-time member, it's almost abuse of their own. Into what they make them go through to potentially get a seat at the table.
Yes, the old hiring hall process still exists there, and one of the other things that we've noticed and been watchful of, which the PMA points out, is that the number of crane operators being sent to the ports has dropped from 110 on a daily basis to 1 or 2. This is obviously a game of brinksmanship, and as Jason pointed out, where does this take the economy? I think we could have one wheel off the cliff, and nobody wants to talk about it. So we expect this to be several months before we get a correction in terms of the economy. But as Lou pointed out, we've seen it in the ISM numbers. I think we're going to see it in the GDP numbers for first quarter. Last year we had a snow and ice storm where we took a hit. This year we're probably going to have a port situation where we took a hit. Quick question for you, both for Jonathan and Jason, but let me go to John first. John, what do the retailers do if they didn't mitigate this with all the goods that are going to come into them in March that they really wanted in November? Are they going to have massive fire sales?
That's a big potential. We heard from numerous retailers who, in their Q3 earnings, talked about the multi-million-dollar hits they were taking, and we expect to see that in Q4 potentially as well. But for those larger retailers who have the option to move their product, they are pretty well situated. But you have small and medium-sized guys who are at the mercy of what's happening at the ports. They've got cargo that's stuck on vessels that haven't even arrived yet. And they're being told it's going to be weeks before they even get to the port, and then weeks after that before it gets out of the port. So, they're doing everything they can, trying to work with their providers for mitigation, but it's going to have a significant impact on a lot of folks if this doesn't get resolved now. And even if they do get to an agreement today, if the parties agreed, you're still looking at least 30 days before ratification, and there's no guarantee during that process that work will return as it was previously. And what we've heard from LA and Long Beach, at a minimum, they're saying 45 to 60 days just to get through the backlog. But it could take even longer. We're coming up on a slow period with the Chinese New Year where some of the vessel arrivals will slow down, but it's going to ramp right up again at the beginning of March. So, this has to get done now. There's no longer waiting for this. This really has to get done ASAP. The president needs to get engaged, get the parties to come to an agreement finally so we can end this national nightmare.
Yeah, there's actually 40 ships currently bobbing around offshore. It was 16 a month ago. So you're right. It's beginning to accelerate again as the ports approach gridlock, which they predict within a week or two at the most, and simply choke themselves down to no operation at all, at which point somebody needs to do something. Jason, how about your retail industry members? Are they looking at fire sales in the spring?
Well, hopefully not, but I'll give you one example of where this has already impacted a retailer, and I don't want to use their name, but we have a company who half of their Valentine's Day product did not arrive. half is not in
Wow.
stores. And they probably have have mitigated any knowledge of that to the consumer because they've adjusted space shelf, and they've probably done some things to make it look like they're fully stocked. But the reality is half the product didn't even show up. So it is going to be a big problem going forward. I mentioned the industries that have really large spring sales, the home improvement, home and garden, your women's fashion in particular. There are a lot of industries where the spring is sort of a second holiday season. And so those industries are going to be hurt if this isn't resolved. I mean, they're already feeling the impact of it, worried about certain products, patio grills, things of that nature that haven't arrived yet, that normally they know are in hand and ready to go to the shelf. So we're already starting to see the impact for those merchandisers, and hopefully this is something that will be mitigated quickly and won't have a lasting impact.
Well, John and Jason and Mark, you're welcome to stay with us. I'd like to introduce Chad Moutre. Chad is the chief economist with the National Association of Manufacturers. And Chad, you're going to share with us kind of the macro effects of this port situation. We're all curious what's going to happen to the GDP. Is the first quarter numbers going to take a hit? How long does it unwind? Does 2015 take a stumble? Chad, how are you doing today?
Good. Nice to be on your show. And I guess I'll get straight to the heart of your question there. I mean, I think, on the positive side, manufacturers had an all-time high for manufactured goods exports last year, $1.4 trillion. But it's pretty clear that, just the slowing global economy, the stronger dollar, and the West Coast ports issue were having an effect, particularly as we got towards the end of the year. We saw a widening of the trade deficit in December, for instance, and I think moving forward, it'll be much more difficult for us to be able to continue to grow exports, given some of these headwinds that we're facing.
Yeah, that's going to be a very tough issue, and I noticed even a year ago the Canadian dollar was, I think, at $1.678. Now it's 80 cents. So certainly exports even to our land-based customers are going to be tough to maintain. Chad, what's going to be the overall effect? How long can we sit here with the world's strongest economy and the world's strongest dollar before something's got to give? Either somebody's got to rise up in another continent, or we're going to have to ramp back.
Well, I think the key thing here is, number one, we want a stronger economy, globally. So I think each of these markets, I think, is important for us. Europe continues to grow, but very sluggishly. We're seeing declining growth in China and South America. I mean, not declining in Asia. In China, essentially, you're seeing decelerating growth. And so, these obviously are huge challenges for us, and certainly the fact, as you mentioned, the dollar is a big challenge. Regarding the West Coast ports issue, I think what we're asking is just for some sense of urgency here. I'm sure you're hearing that from other manufacturers as well. This uncertainty really is something that is hurting us. It's certainly impacting manufacturers in terms of their being able to get product, get inputs into the production process, and they're spending an awful lot of money to be able to really try to mitigate that uncertainty. And so that, I think, is one of the bigger issues for us, first and foremost right now, is finding a way to have a sense of urgency to bring the parties to the table so we can have some sense of conclusion to this. Otherwise, we're just going to continue meandering along, and this is not helpful for anybody.
Chad, this is Lou. I'd like to ask, what is SNAM's role right now in terms of trying to reach out to those in power, the White House, Congress, and so on, to do something?
Well, we
know you have a loud voice, you have huge membership, and I'm sure you're doing something. So why don't you share with our listeners and our manufacturers who are listening today?
Well, you're right. We've been reaching out to the White House. I'm pretty constant contact with the White House, again, trying to get them to to make sure that they get involved as much as they can, not just follow the progress, but hopefully get more involved in the negotiation. We also have been talking to folks up on the Hill again to see if we can try to get some sense of urgency there as well. And then the other big thing that we're doing right now is our president and CEO is on the state of manufacturing tour. He's going all around the country. Yesterday he was in Seattle. He's on his way to Denver. And so, going out there and beating the drum really to make sure that people around the country are get more aware of this issue, because certainly I've been hearing this from manufacturers for quite some time, but the more we can continue to beat the drum and get it out there in the media, and by Jay listening to manufacturers, I think that you're really able to really hone in on really what some of their own personal challenges are, and I think that we can echo that not just on our blog, but also when we're speaking to the White House or to the Hill.
You weren't in the first part of the show, and I had asked the question of our other guests about the apparent indifference of the media, namely the network news programs, NBC, ABC, Fox, CNN, and all the rest. What's that all about? Don't they hear the hoofbeats on the planes as to what's going on?
Well, maybe we need to do a better job of making sure they do hear it. I know that, I have CNBC on all day long, and they're doing a really good job of covering it. They're doing a good job of covering the study that we did with the National Retail Federation that really shows, that a prolonged strike, for instance, were to go to that, would cost, well over $2 billion a day. So, you are having some media outlets cover it. We would like to see more cover it, and hopefully, if we continue to beat the drum loud enough, we'll get those major networks to cover it as well. And you are starting to see it come up a little bit more. I know that even in the Institute for Supply Management's last report, the ISM report, you had two commenters mention the West Coast port strike, and so it's starting to seep into the mainstream comments. Hopefully, we can get it to be even louder. And I think the other challenge is that we aren't into a strike situation or a lockout situation yet, and typically the mainstream media is going to be covering those types of stories. They aren't talking about the slowdown issue as much because it doesn't have the sex appeal that a strike might have. So I think that's the other issue, is that because there isn't a sense of urgency, people aren't covering it as much.
Do you not feel that a comment from the White House directly to the media would wake the folks up that are behind the mics to get into this story?
I agree. I think the White House could be more vocal there. I know that Jack Lew, the Treasury Secretary, was asked about it yesterday on CNBC. So they are talking about it, but they aren't certainly being as vocal as they perhaps could be to get even more coverage in the media.
Mm-hmm.
Chad, I know that 2015, at least as you looked at it in September, for the economy looked pretty rosy. Is 2015 still looking as rosy, or now with some of the retail reports coming out and everybody is changing their guidance, 2015 not looking so good?
Well, I think overall manufacturers continue to be mostly upbeat about 2015. I still see roughly 3% growth, not just for GDP but also for industrial production. With that said, and you just said it, we saw a lot of weaker numbers in both December and January for retail sales, for industrial production, and I wouldn't be shocked if we see sentiment go down a little bit more from those really, really optimistic numbers we had in December. We had a survey, actually, that came out in December that said that 91% of our members were positive in their own company's outlook. I wouldn't be shocked to see that edge a little bit lower when we survey them again in February, later this month. Mm-hmm. And I think the biggest part of it is the reason what I just said earlier: sluggish growth overseas, the strong dollar, the West Coast ports issue, a bunch of other factors. I think still a cautious consumer overall. Those are downward risks, I think, to the economy. Not enough to really change the forecast all that much just yet. We're going to be watching it pretty closely. But I think certainly it's going to take a little bit of the edge of that optimism off a little bit.
Chad is chief economist for the National Association of Manufacturers, and since you're new to our show, can you share with our listeners what it is you do with NAM and the kinds of things that you look at?
Well, I guess, first and foremost, I guess I'm a talking head. So any economic number that comes out, jobs numbers last week or GDP, I'm out there usually trying to talk to the media about what that means for manufacturers. I go around the country also giving my forecast. So I'm heading to the Midwest on Thursday and Friday this week, for instance, to do that. So just being out there, being present, and talking about manufacturing and the economy is my primary role. The other big part of what I do as chief economist at the NAM is, we're a trade association, so we need to go out and advocate on a number of issues, whether that's tax reform or trade or regulatory issues of any kind. And so my job is to put numbers to that. I mentioned to you earlier a study we did on the West Coast ports issue that was actually released last June. So I was responsible for commissioning that, and we try to look at what issues are going to be up and coming, and where we don't have publicly available data, from time to time we'll commission a study that hopefully helps us move the ball on those issues. And so we've had a number of those in the last year. Beyond the ports issue, we also had infrastructure and regulation and tax reform and the environmental issues that have really been first and foremost in many manufacturers' minds over the last year. And we've tried providing studies to kind of help the lobbyists down the hall here with those issues.
Now, the study that you did with the National Retail Federation, which projects a $2 billion a day loss if a strike should occur, and in talking with Peter and Mark and John and Jason, I almost suspect that we're already seeing some losses. Was that direct cost or indirect cost or both? That was both. And, the study looked specifically at what would happen if there was a stoppage, and we don't have a stoppage. But as you note, these slowdowns that we're experiencing are also quite severe, and we're probably getting something close to that already, I would imagine, just simply by virtue of the fact that so many manufacturers that we hear from are having to come up with alternatives to get product on the shelves or to get raw materials that they need for production. So I think we're already getting some of those numbers, even without actually having a stoppage. Mm-hmm. And I see that car manufacturers that Lou was talking about earlier, Toyota just took out all of their overtime because they can't get parts. Some of the other U.S. manufacturers who are bringing parts in from overseas are now flying in parts just to complete their assemblies. Are you seeing the same kind of things in just automotive or other industries as well, Chad? It's across the board. We're hearing similar things about companies who are having to use air freight to be able to get raw materials to their to what they need. I think the other issue that it really comes up quite a bit is we're also seeing competitiveness being put at risk. When our foreign competitors are seeing this happening, and they're saying, well, maybe given that West Coast ports issue, maybe a more reliable way of getting product on the shelves is for you to buy from us. And so I think we're also starting to hear some anecdotal evidence where foreign competitors are using this issue against us in terms of competition. And I think that's really the bottom line here, is that exports are a huge engine of growth for manufacturers in the United States. We already are seeing it challenged by sluggish growth overseas and the dollar. The last thing we need is another real damaging impact, which is what we're seeing from this West Coast ports closure issue. And that was really, exports are, if my number's correct, 12.5% of the GDP. Is that correct, Chad? I'd have to go back and look at the actual number, but I don't know if it's 12.5%, but it is a pretty sizable number. Okay, and you do bring up the same point that Peter and some of our other guests have brought up, that we are going to take a global hit on our reputation because we can't be reliably called upon to export goods for those manufacturers overseas who viewed us as part of their supply chain.
That's right.
So I don't know how severe that's going to be. Do you have any feel for that? Or maybe we can get you back in a show 2-3 months down the road, and you can give us a sense of what may have happened because of this.
Well, I'll go back and correct my answer from a second ago. Manufacturing is 12.5% of GDP, so that shows you the extent of manufacturing. But again, I'll go back to what I said earlier, and that is that we need a strong and growing trade base to be able to continue to grow the companies that are in our membership, and they need a reliable supply chain. They need to have the ports open so they can get product to and from their production process. And this is really, I think, going to be something that, this is the last thing they need at this particular point in terms of our economic recovery.
Well, we certainly will extend an invitation back to you, Chad, to join us again, maybe in February. You're doing some of the updates across the Midwest. We'd certainly love to hear from you again. If we can get 10 or 15 minutes of your time. I know you've got other things on your schedule that you have to run and do, but we want to thank you for being on the show.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it, and anytime.
Thank you, Chad.
Great.
We appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
Gentlemen, I just wanted to reach back to whoever's still on the call with us, and if it's just
you
and I, Lou, I guess we need... Okay, well... So, this has been a great show. A great show in terms of contribution from people around the country, not necessarily good news for the economy. But
actually, if you just hold it a second, I have to climb in off of the ledge.
Right.
This is, you're right, it has been a great informative show. We had some great, well-informed people from all walks of industry, from geographically from all over the country, who presented what you and I picked up on several months ago with regards to the port issue. And it does seem as though that there are more and more people beginning to become aware. Nowhere in these discussions, this one as well as the other two port shows that we did have, has anyone definitively come up with a conclusion or solution other than the fact that having our El Presidente speak up and lay it out and have the nerve to take on the union and to protect American manufacturing and American industry. And I'm feeling very disappointed. I'm disappointed in the email that I got back, even though I did get an email, which in itself was surprising, but I did get an email saying that we're watching. Well, we're watching too, and we know how to cure it. And these gentlemen who have been on the show 2 or 3 times, they know how to cure it. And he's standing out on the ledge, hoping for the immovable object and the irresistible force to solve a problem that is going to drive this country into an economic debacle. And I feel it coming.
Yeah, it's certainly becoming a mess. And I just want to share with our listeners who are, kind of following the story. If you go to mfgtalkradio.com, if you go to our website, you will see that there are stacks and stacks and stacks of containers that have been taken off ships sitting idle at the port, that they can't pull them out fast enough for all kinds of reasons. They can't offload the 40 ships that are bobbing around in the ocean. And as you heard on the show, now they can't get empty containers to the empty ships to send them back overseas to get more goods to bring here. And it could easily be 6 months, as it was in 2002, before this whole thing unravels. And there's no guarantee of that because, as one of our contributors pointed out, the ramp-up occurs now in March, April for the spring sales. This will be a very tough year for imports and exports.
My suggestion, being that our audience is to a great extent manufacturing, my suggestion is that if you are buying goods, particularly from Asia, that perhaps you better start looking at that situation and see if you can outsource in other areas, be it South America or Europe, or if in Asia, shipping it to other ports other than the West Coast. And matter of fact, we did also look at, there's a new port that's opened up down in Mexico across from San Diego, which is becoming a real port hotspot. Houston is a very active port, as long as you're not bringing in real heavy goods. The East Coast, just to give you an idea about the automation issue that is part of the port issue, West Coast port issue, is that under normal circumstances in L.A., they are unloading 25 containers per hour at the port. On the East Coast, they are unloading 47 containers an hour per ship. So obviously, it is it's a robotic automation issue. The fear of loss of jobs. Frankly, in my opinion, anybody can make as much money as they can, but my God, $147,000 a year for somebody on the job 3 years. Because, and what no one mentioned previously in this show was that 147, if you're on the job, I don't know how many years, if it's 10 or 15 years, you're earning not $147,000, you're earning $300,000. And unfortunately, I'm not throwing anybody any mercy when you're making that kind of money. You really ought to be thinking a little bit about the country, and they're not. And neither is the union, and neither is the PMA.
No, the only good news in this for a lot of us is that when they go for the redistribution of wealth that they've been talking about, and they're pointing the fingers at all the fat cats, well, guess what? The fat cats work for the unions. So prepare yourself, because they're reaching into your union pockets to get the money.
Well, those salaries, by the way, that I mentioned are not the union fat cats at the top. Those are the workers. Those are the guys on the pier. So the fat cats are making a lot more money than what I just laid out. So it's a terrible situation. I don't really see a whole lot of solution coming down the pike. Maybe Obama, when he hits the Los Angeles area, I don't know, is it this week or next? I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe he's got a surprise message for the country. We'll be looking for it, I'm sure.
I do want to, before we close up the show here, send out a special thanks to Peter Friedman, the Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, who was on our show. Mark Herzl, who's President of the Los Angeles Custom Brokers and Freight Forwarders Association, who contributed today. Jonathan Gold, Vice President, Supply Chain and Customs Policy with the National Retail Federation, and Jason Brewer, Vice President, Communications and Advocacy for the Retail Industry Leaders Association. Look, we couldn't do a show like this and get the kind of information out to our listeners that they need to hear without people like this being willing to step up onto Manufacturing Talk Radio. And we're not a gotcha radio show. Our mission is to get good information out to the industry without really putting anybody on the spot except our government. They're right in the bullseye for anything that they could fix and aren't fixing. So we want to thank everybody for listening, and also we want to extend invitations back to them. We want to thank Chad Moutre, the Chief Economist of the National Association of Manufacturers, for taking some time to join us on the show, and we look forward to him coming back, Lou.
Yeah, and I'd like to just mention to all who are listening who did not perhaps listen to the whole show, in about an hour and a half from now, please come to mfgtalkradio.com and listen to the entire show in its entirety. And also, we are going to be rebroadcasting this entire show on Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And, have your friends and families and cousins and uncles tune into it. It's important stuff. We really need to get the message out. And it wouldn't hurt to send your congressman, your president, a message, an email, telling him, let's put a stop to this. So on that note, it's been a great show, Tim, and thank you.
Thanks for joining us on Manufacturing Talk Radio. You can hear our next broadcast each Tuesday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time at mfgtalkradio.com.